such a pleasure to be here. That reminds me of last year. I was here about the same time. The grass was just as green and the sun was just as enjoyable. And it's just good to be back here to talk about our favorite subject. So I thought, before I start, I just want to remind us that we're, as hunters really are people, are providers of meat. That's what a hunter is. And we've lost sight of that. Even though we make our sausages and do our thing, we've got to remind ourselves that it's always meat first. We do this as an activity that dates back thousands of years. And this is what we are. We're people who seek animals for consumption. And the antlers and the horns are just that little extra to remind us of the good times and the tough times that really we spend getting our meat. And we're going to see where in some parts of the world that is still a very important function. Anyway, let's get on with the subject. A short while ago, after some considerable communications with some folks down in Idaho, I was able to get information that was almost horrific. The impacts of predation have finally taken root. There are people now actually coming to realize that a lot of the activities that are taking place in the natural history world and in this new world of wonder around biodiversity and natural harmony and the balance of nature, all that warm and fuzzy stuff has taken on a new meaning for people, and it's been known for some time now. Last year I mentioned Henry Buller, this individual who talked about this in Europe. 15 years ago he was saying there's a new kind of person developing, and a lot of them don't identify with what we do. And it's difficult to communicate with some of them. In fact, some of them are impossible to communicate with, and we don't want to waste our time trying to do that. But what has happened is that the people in Idaho really precipitated this whole thing. Suddenly somebody said, look, we got a problem out there. And with the research that we're going to discuss here, that problem was passed on to government, which they all have to, that's where they all have to go. And the governments in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and believe it or not, Wisconsin, have said, yep, we're going to do something about those animals. So that's where I start. Then I put together a few words, and I titled my paper, The Big Bad Wolf, Good or Bad? And I just sort of summarized some of the things that I thought were important. And then shortly after, I'm able to get more information, and I've modified the presentation to include the original with a slight overlap with a second one, which is more information about the first, and then some remarks about what I think we have to do to get in step with the people who are leading the charge now. The big bad wolf, how big and how bad? We'll start with just a quick rundown. Okay? I asked everybody to take a quick read. And so what we have here is a bit of history. I mean, wolves have been with men and humans for forever, and they still are, more so than we'd appreciate. But what I thought I would do is find places where there weren't any. Because in those places, believe it or not, people have been able to do things that we would dearly love to see. So I found 3 islands. I found Anacostia Island, Newfoundland, and Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And what was interesting, Cape, for example, in size, we all relate to Vancouver Island. Okay, if you compare Anacostia is about a quarter the size of Vancouver Island. Newfoundland is 3 times the size of Vancouver Island, and Cape Breton is about a quarter the size. Now this is really fascinating because Anticosti Island, there was never any ungulates on the island. And in, believe it or not, 1895, after it was purchased by Henri Menier, he was a chocolatier, but he loved to hunt. So he bought the island and decided maybe it would be a good idea to put some white-tailed deer on the island. Well, it wasn't not only a good idea, it was a fantastic idea, because in about 30 or 40 years, he ended up with 160,000 of them. But now there's only about 120,000. It's one of the most popular whitetail hunting areas in that part of the, I guess you would say, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. You take a ferry to get there. And believe it or not, they hunt them mainly in November. They shut the season down in October. There's not much of a season. But believe me, it's a very busy place, and hunting is still going on after 120 years. Now that's success. Newfoundland was just as good or better. But they decided, now if you keep in mind, those animals never existed there. Can you imagine trying to make a transplant today? It would be next to impossible. But Newfoundland was really good. They had to try twice to get moose, and these would be the eastern subspecies, to get moose established on the island. And the purpose was for hunting, guided hunting, money, revenue. And hell, it was still a colony, a British colony in 1949. And it was Joey Smallwood who made it happen. It became a province. But anyway, the moose flourished, as you would expect. So in Newfoundland, those people are really, they're happy about what they've got. They have their guiding industry, and they got a source of meat, a reliable source of meat. They're hunters. In fact, the government boasts, yes, I like this, for every 2 moose, a license. And they sell 70,000 licenses a year, kill 19,000 moose, and are happy as hell doing it. So that's a success. There weren't any moose there in the first place. And Cape Breton was different. The history here is complicated. The moose and the wolves, there were wolves then in Nova Scotia, but the moose that existed there and the wolves disappeared. We probably know why. But by 1890, they were gone. Now, go back to those times and you wonder, how the hell that happened? I've tried to find more historical information, couldn't find it. But anyway, the government decided to introduce moose, reintroduce them to Cape Breton Island, and they got some from Elk Island National Park. Wrong subspecies. The western moose were bigger, a little more aggressive than the eastern variety, but they didn't protest. They increased and they got to about 5,000, and people are arguing about who's going to get them. Anyway, so that's a situation that's kind of worrisome, because when you get people fighting over the spoils, the outcomes are usually either unpredictable or unpleasant. So we'll just leave that. That's sort of on my radar to see what's going to happen. But the upshot of it all was somebody took the time to think about doing something really interesting, and it worked. Good ideas usually turn out well. And so 120 years ago, I salute those people who did that. And I got to say, this is the kind of thinking and this is the approach we have to take today to reestablish the hunting and the animal populations that we know we had in the past. I recommended this immediately. This is going to be the main source of material for the subject that we're going to discuss now. But I suggest you go through these links, because every one of them either is ups, they compound. The information is fascinating, but this stuff here is becoming very political. What we see here is the reaction of, mainly in Americans, of course, people taking the steps to deal with predation that has become a problem, and the predators that are being identified are wolves, plain and simple. And one little bit here in BC, which is actually encouraging, is that BC had no choice. They had to start doing something about predation, wolf predation, particularly around the caribou. And so BC is already committed doesn't like to be committed, but is committed. And so, in fact, the people down south are saying, well, look, our friends up north are making sure they're going to protect their caribou by getting rid of the animals that are getting rid of the caribou, and we're going to do the same for our elk and our moose and our deer. And by God, they're going to do it. Okay, let's just skim on. Okay, it is this that led me to do what I consider my next one, and I really enjoy this. At the end of my presentation, I pondered. This is interesting here for me. I thought, okay, what is it about all of these people who insist on telling you and me that our ecosystems are incomplete? They're trashed because we don't have the animals and plants that were originally here. They've just completely excluded this one simple fact that before any of us got here, and I'm talking about our ancestors, the people who lived here, the indigenous people here, lived in a place that wasn't a wilderness. They used it. And so these people today, these newbies, think that the world that we're trying to change was a wilderness. Well, it wasn't. Wilderness is really a challenge that we should take up. We've got to remind people that whenever they talk about a wilderness, they're talking about something in their own mind. It's an imaginary concept. This land that we are standing on, living on today, was used in so many different ways, but it was always about feeding themselves. And this is something we just take for granted. But really, this is what it is. This place was used and used well, believe it or not. You know, the way their meat supply and their fish supply chains was often very, very tenuous, and people starved to death. But we're lucky we don't have those problems today. One day maybe we will. But the fact is, the people who are really fat and sassy now think this world now, everything that takes place from here on in will be their history. And their history, they think they're writing it by changing the way everybody else lives, and it's founded around this new identity, this new vision of the world. And maybe I'm at the end of my limits of imagination, but some of the people I engage with honestly believe that this place that we occupy has been destroyed by us. And I take real exception to that. In many cases, the environment that we live in and are modifying is for the better, by a long shot. But they don't see it that way. This is really a hard one for me to put my head around. But anyway, so I decided to look at this question here. I mean, a wolf is neither good nor bad. I mean, this is logic. A wolf doesn't answer to any moral code, doesn't have to. It's just killing to eat. But humans do, and this is where the morality issue comes into the argument about the behavior. The outcomes of wolf behaviors are very damaging to what we do as hunters and what ranchers and farmers do as farmers and ranchers and outfitters. But to a lot of people, it's not. Our behavior is the bad behavior. And so this is becoming an ideological clash. So we'll just skim by it. But believe me, these guys are part of the process too. And we'll get on to that now, okay? So are wolves good or bad? We're going to look at the bad stuff. Now this is interesting. George Pauley was a biologist. I don't know if he still works for the game department in Idaho, but the elk numbers were coming down. They were just tumbling across the state, but more so in the low zone. And I worked just over the mountains from the low zone in 1966. Fantastic elk country. It's the upper Lochsaw and Selway River systems, just east of where I fish on the Clearwater. But the elk numbers were really crashing. look, have a look. But Paulie, I've only got four of his 9 slides, but about here, 2009, from about there, 2014, you can see the slope. He has the identical curve, but in the next slide, he has a blue line under this curve. He killed 48 wolves. He was killing wolves as a form of predator control, and it didn't work. Have a look. It just continued. But to be fair, this is really important. What we had here are elk hunters and wolves working together. And that's where they are now. And that's what we did here in the Kootenays. We're not taking wolves like we are. We're getting a few, Bobby Ferris and some of the other guys. But this is what's happened here. We're going to get into that. Next one, please. So this is what Paulie did. He said, look, you know, we removed 48 wolves, and it didn't have any effect on the population. Well, of course, we're still hunting, you know, you have to understand. So he looked at some wolf reproductive behavior dynamics and said, look, if we take out 70 wolves out of 100, let's just look at it this way. If we took out 70% of the wolves, 70 out of 100, well, the following year we'd still have half of them, you know. So obviously we have to remove more. So he said, well, look, folks, he's made this presentation to the Game Commission in Idaho, and it was a very impacting experience. But he said, well, look, if we go to 80, well, we still have 40 left. So he said, well, 90, we still have a third of them next year. And so Idaho said, well, I don't think we can politically go, I'm assuming this, we can't go to 100 yet. Well, we're going to go with 90. So the government says, yep, we're going to remove 90% of the wolves, certainly in the low zone. Okay, next. It's serious. So, and this is a wonderful graph. He just laid out what I showed you in the previous slide here. Okay, see this? He laid this out and then said, okay, on the upside, if we remove 70% of the wolves, we might get about 2% back if we're lucky. And so this is what he is saying. Well, not 2% a slice. He said, if we go to 80, look, it's still skimpy. It's still skimpy. Now, the question is here, are we going to be hunting them there? I doubt it. But these are very conservative. I think these are very conservative numbers. I think we could get a more rapid response depending on how we allocate animals or if we allocate them. Next one. Okay, and this is what he says. These are words instead of numbers. He said without wolf removal, he said we're going to lose 16% per year. Still going to keep going down. He said now with 90% to 100% wolf removal, we could see maybe 3% a year increase. Now that's a small percentage, but I think we can fudge there. We could do better than that. And like he says here, with 90 to 100, the best case is 7%. Well, at 7%, it takes 10 years to double. Now that's without any shooting or any other mortality. But believe me, we are looking at drastic measures here. This is hard sell. And just think about it, if we don't do this, it's not going to be very good hunting for a long time, if hunting at all. Next one, please. Yeah. Now this one here is interesting, and I've got to spend a little time on it. The Idaho sportsmen are like the BC Wildlife Federation, only much more effective and practical. So what they did here, they have summarized all of the hunting, all of the elk that were killed by hunters in every management unit in Idaho. And the worst one, of course, was the Lolo unit. Now, to be fair, there are other units, management units in this state that aren't like this. And so I'm not going to dump on the agency, but if you go to the link on this one, you can see these results harvest results in every management unit. And these are game statistics from Idaho Fish and Game. So these are real numbers, and these are numbers that we don't have in BC, but should have. We'll get to that in a minute. But the Lolo unit is really an incredible unit because it was so popular. It's much like our region here. A lot of backcountry hunting, outfitters, and people who love to go out during the rut and do the bugle thing and all the rest. And this is what's happened. I mean, it has literally crashed. And what we have here now is a predator pit. And we'll get on to predator pits. But the fish and game folks in Idaho, to be quite fair, were stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, I know what it's like to be in a situation where you're damned if you don't and damned if you do. But they had a couple of units, management units, where elk are a nuisance. Elk are out there feeding on crops that farmers are not happy about this impact that suddenly has emerged. And it's very, very hard to deal with. But so what the game people did was said, okay, we'll accommodate you. We understand what your problem is, but it's going to be a tough one. So what they did was they had conservation officers go out to the problem areas and hunt those elk down, those nuisance elk, at night with night scopes. Now think about that. If they allowed the public to do it, what they would be doing would be legitimizing night hunting. And that just isn't going to work. So they're in an awful situation here, but they did it, and some hunters complained, and I can understand why. They said, well, why can't we do it? And I'm sure if you sat down with the right people, you could do it. But think about dealing with a wider public. And so they did what they did, and I say, well, hair on you, good on you for doing it. But at the same time, here we are, we're pressing them to get rid of the wolves, and they've got to deal with getting rid of the elk. So you understand what I'm saying? And so I'm going to give them 9 out of 10 for trying to solve a problem, because that's what it is.
We have, with Bobby Ferris, for example, I'll use that as an example. Bobby Ferris was sent out on the calving range to kill wolves. And my point is this: we're dealing with one predator here. And then you know it better than anybody that we have 6 other predators that are just as effective on all of our big game. So Bobby goes out to kill wolves on a ranch. And when he first went out, he said, this isn't wolf kills, it's coyote kills. And they're cats, right? He killed, in 1 week, he trapped 17 coyotes. And he couldn't keep them because he was being paid to trap wolves. He had to throw them over the bank, and they were in February, they were usable. That's what we're dealing with. Like that, at least they've got contact with their ministry. I don't know who has in BC who can make this kind of a presentation and educate them we got a major problem here. How do we go? Where do we go from here? That's the issue.
Well, the issue really is first understanding what predation is really all about. Yeah. They just don't. It's all the convenient.
For predators.
But
that's
no.
The issue.
Yeah, but the convenient explanation that you get is, well, it's natural. It's just natural. Well, yeah. Well, what are the limits of natural? Okay, let's go to the next one. Now what we just saw was the same thing that's happened here. Now we can't say with certainty up until 2002, but these are real numbers, the kind of numbers that we used to work with, the kind of numbers that I worked with, that Bill worked with. They're real. We can't find numbers like this anymore. But if you look at this, the yellow graph is the unit of effort. Bill's out there flying, and this is the time he spends flying. But no matter how much time he had spent over this period, if you look at these numbers here, that is really neat, because what we're looking at here is the number of calves per 100 cow elk. And it's up there just skimming under 40 per 100 cows. And that's really good. At the middle of winter and in the spring after a long, hard winter, that's a really nice graph. We should be really content with that. Okay, and the wolves are starting to come. They're starting to howl here, but we don't know what's beyond.
Well, I think we know.
And no, you see, this is what we need to make sure we can confirm what happened. We don't get numbers anymore, do we, Billy? Okay, go ahead. I'd like you to comment just briefly about this one.
I don't think, as beyond my personal opinion, they don't wanna show us the information. We all know what it is, it's been shown in other places, but that's not a priority for them.
But what we have to do is make it a priority for us.
Exactly.
And what we need to do is the group and the sportsmen have to start taking the numbers so they can have the numbers, because if you have the numbers, they can't argue with you.
Exactly.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, but this is a classic here. Okay, it's 5 years ago this July. Al Gorley had an assignment by government to go out and do something about the moose population that had collapsed across BC. But I want to say there aren't any numbers in this report to government. And then when you look at this, it's a strategy to help. Help? What's help? It should have been a strategy to increase the population of moose to 150,000 per management unit. We don't have any numbers. These people they're not numerical or they're innumerate. But if you read this report, it's available. All you see are the Venn diagrams with these wonderful, wonderful explanations that are all imagined. This is imagineering, it's not engineering. Engineers use real numbers. Imagineers don't, they invent ideas. Next one, please. But then we found some new numbers. I went looking for numbers that somewhere existed somewhere in government, and this is what I stumbled on. I would urge all of you to go to the Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation website when you get home. If you want to get your blood pressure up, you got to read this. But these are the numbers that were posted in this year's. This is the 2021 budget, and this is what they call impact. Impact. What impact? What have they got? A grizzly bear up here. We don't hunt grizzly bears anymore, but grizzly bears are an impact. But you find out the awards that they've given, grants that they've awarded to people to do whatever with wildlife, mainly animals that we don't use. These are bats and butterflies and all of the animals that we don't even consider. But we have funded this. This stuff here, this is stuff that we were responsible for starting. And here we are now, 2,980 projects, and they brag about it. They've spent $189 million. Mind you, they've managed to acquire 25,000 hectares of land. Well, there's no point in getting land if you don't manage it effectively. But I want to say that after $189 million since 1981, why are we up here complaining about the dearth of moose, elk, and deer in our province? And so these are the numbers, only numbers I could find that gave me some understanding of what was really happening to the fund that we established to make sure that we wouldn't be up here talking about wondering where our animals went and talking about some things like the predation that we have to deal with. Next one. Okay, now this is to get off this depressing subject. This is one of my favorite websites. In Scandinavia, well, Fenno-Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, are really finicky about data, numbers. They have I guess they have a branch of government, a statistics branch of government where they take measurements and statistics of just about everything they do in Norway. And it's fantastic. Now here we are, look at 2021 season. I got these numbers on March 22nd, 23rd, because at the end of last year's season, they said that these data were going to be available in March 23rd. And here they are. Okay, now listen, this has been going on now for at least since 1965, 67, and I got this from personal communication in the company of a Norwegian moose manager and forester who was responsible for a lot of the management that ends up with numbers like this. Well, let's just take a look down here if you can. This is what's really fascinating. If you tally the bulls and cows, males, females, and you look at the ages, 60% of the harvest in all these years, this is what they do, 60%, plus or minus, up or down a few percent, are young animals. 60% are animals 2.5, 1.5, and calves. They still call them calves over there because they are. So they have a system of management that works. And what is really important, and it doesn't show here, is that the thing that makes this harvest possible is access. They are able to spread their hunters out. Okay? And the most important thing here too is 90% of this land is private land. People farm on it and they farm trees on it as well. So these people are really very close to the land. You know the old saying, you know, everybody thinks that we don't identify or live with the land, but we're all terrestrial animals. But in Norway, they really are. Let's go to the next one. This one is really interesting. Can you imagine? Now red deer are elk up here. They're slightly different in appearance. But can you imagine when you look at this number? Last year I think they killed 46,000. In 2021 they killed 50,000 red deer. And when you go to the actual numbers of hunters, it was about 50,000 hunters. The hunter success for red deer in Norway this last season was 101%. Thank you. I mean, this is what's fascinating because, gentlemen, these are real numbers. When was the last time we saw numbers of any kind? I wouldn't say nearly as half of this, but numbers that are statistically evident of what we in BC can say hunters are actually responsible for. Look, that's an incredible number. And it was taken by people who are out there getting their meat. They don't have too many big bulls, but that really is. That's a meat show too. And I've got to say, it's the same for their wild reindeer, only the numbers are much lower, and their roe deer, and any of the other ungulates. But can you imagine, just imagine, 50,000 BC elk hunters killing 50,000 elk. Not in your life. Okay, let's go to the really interesting next one. Okay, now, they even keep track, close track, of the animals that are killed other than by hunters. And this is really fascinating. You can get them all. The number of red deer that are killed, the number of moose that are killed on the highways or railways, whether they drown or not. But if you look here at the moose, I mean, I have to focus my eyes here. Okay, moose, the tally here, was 983 moose. You know, that's a lot of moose. In BC, northern BC, when I was working in the 60s and 70s, we killed that many on the railroad alone, I'm sure. I had a couple of years when the roadmasters were bringing in some of the numbers for me. The numbers were off, you know, they were kind of scattered because they weren't consistent. Some people were more diligent about providing the numbers than others. But I estimated that from Red Pass and Red Pass and Robson to, I would say Cedar Vale, halfway between Terrace and Smithers. We were killing up to 2,000 moose on the CNR. Oh yeah, I mean, those are big numbers. But that's how many moose we had. I mean, in BC, in that part of BC alone, when I was up working there, we were killing 25,000 moose a year for 5, 6, 7 years. It was wonderful. But at the same time, we had stopped aerial baiting in 1964. We started in 48, but we ended in 64, and they returned. By the time I left in 1974 to come down here, the wolves were, they were starting to show up where we didn't want them to show up. And they're still there. Okay? So back to this one. Bill's got something here that I think that we should, I'm going to ask him to talk about some of this stuff here. Go ahead, Billy.
Okay, what I've got here is an old report. It says BC Environment on it. And it says large mammal, rodent, and rail kill from 89 to 93. And it was continued by the Highways Department after that. And I don't know for how long, but it gives you the number of animals by management unit killed by cars and by trains for BC. And it gives you summaries and all the rest of it. And I've got a lot of doubt that we still have them, but the thing is that at one time, Wildlife Branch used numbers. They had data systems that were based on numbers. And a lot of those right now, I don't know how much they're being used. Some of them are still being maintained, probably because they've always done it. But the thing is, who uses them? And this one is really interesting if you guys want to look at it later. And it's got a really great drawing on it. Carmen and Kenny really like it. It's the deer in the car.
Right.
The train and the moose.
But you see, the point I'm trying to make here, though, is those are real numbers.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of activities that we were always involved in. We couldn't manage a forest without numbers. In fact, go back to that one in the Idaho one for me, would you please? Yep, back one more. Whoa, stop right there. Oh, there, right there, come on. Okay, just imagine if you had a meeting with your financial advisor and you were examining your pension fund, okay? And your financial advisor had, I don't know if she or he would have tears in her eyes, but when they put this graph on the table for you to examine, and numbers like this with dollar signs in front of them, you would say, oh my God, I'm broke. I'm out of here. I got to go back to work. What have you done to my pension fund? Now, on the other hand, if you were a financial analyst, an economist, and speaking on, on television at a conference about the state of the economy, and these numbers came up, you'd probably say with absolute certainty, this is definitely a bear market. This is a horrible bear market, and it's been running now for, oh my goodness, for almost 10 or 12 years. And I would sit back as a game manager and say, well, yeah, definitely a bear market. I'd say a bear market with cougar underpinnings, but we've missed the wolf factor. What we have now is a wolf market. This is what it is. This is amazing. But this is why you need numbers. If you haven't got numbers, you can't measure whatever it is you're doing. And this is it. This is probably one of the most impressive graphs with tables I've seen in a long, long time. We don't want to see any more of these kinds of numbers.
Ken said something last night that was kind of important to all of us here, and it's got to be said here, and I'm sorry we're not all here, that we need to put together a symposium like we did last year in the Key City Theater with this fellow from the Lolo herd. That's one. Geist would be the other. Jim Beers would be another. And other professionals that have handled and know exactly what Ken is talking about, and Ken would be one of those as well, There's no local biologist that we'd be able to trust to put on. Maybe we should ask them to attend and make a presentation, tell us how good they're doing. But I don't think they would even want to get on stage, because if they had any brains at all, they would know that they would be so embarrassed that they couldn't possibly answer what Ken's just saying. Like, if you had a financial manager, you'd fire him if that happened. Or if you had a forest manager, and I always said that the foresters in British Columbia should all be fired when we burned the central part of British Columbia down, because we didn't need to. We didn't need to. They knew. I know they knew, because I was on the Forest Resources Commission, and as commissioner I said, if we don't start logging now, we'll lose it to either to bugs or fire, and that was in 1989. That's when that was stated. It burned in 2003, and then it burned again heavily in 2015, wasn't it? 2015?
Anyway, I knew you'd enjoy this.
Well, it's
Okay, this is a predator pit. Now, the Americans, this is really fascinating. In Alaska, they define this pit here, this predator pit. They have a really highfalutin name. It's a euphemism, I would like to say, that I find quite delightful. It's a population, a low-density population in a dynamic state of equilibrium. Here's what happens. The wolves take the caribou and the moose down, but so do the grizzly bears and the black bears. But the bears and the wolves and the hunters, of course, are part of the process too. When they take them down, it's the grizzly bears that keep it down. They maintain the predator pit. They take care of the black bears, they eat them. And they do their fair share of getting caribou, calves, and adults, and moose too. And the poor wolves have to move on and look for more. But seriously, this is really fascinating stuff. This is a predator behavior in a combined way that that a lot of people just ignore. But believe me, Tom Bergerud, who is Mr. Caribou, and excuse me, and George Pauly, who described this, and Dr. Charles Kay, our good friend and colleague, have been describing this for a long time. And back in 1983, it was John Elliott, bless Dr. John, and they threw him under the bus, but he recognized this starting to happen up in the Muskwa-Kachika. And when he went to do something about the problem, the government said, well, we don't think so. Well, it's just not going to work. So he knew what had to be done to prevent this from happening. And unfortunately, it was a bad time. We've hit the same wall here today in the Kootenays. We know that what we're looking at now is in the Kootenays for elk and certainly moose. This is what we have. We have an LDDE, alias predator pit. Okay, and now when you sit down and stroke your chin and say, okay, how are we going to get from here to there? Look at the years. I tell you, folks, there isn't going to be a lot of really good hunting for a while if we want to get from here even to here. That's what we're facing now. And so the generation of hunters today just don't realize the abundance that some of us old-timers experience. I mean, I jumped ahead in my presentation for time, but I can tell you, when I was a teenager over in the other side of the Rockies there in the foothills, southern foothills, on a good day in November, out on a mule deer hunt in the foothills, I'd say 100 mule deer a day, easily, and as many elk. And my best day, my very best day, was over 1,000 elk in one herd. I couldn't believe it. Hunting was like out of this world. And when I tell some of my friends and colleagues about those numbers today, I get these glassy stares. They don't believe me. But that's what we had. And it was the same with the moose in central BC. The density we had, densities of moose were the same. We had high ungulate populations because we didn't have the wolf predation today that we have. So what are we going to do? everybody says, all right, you're just telling us how bad things are. What are we going to do? Well, it's pretty simple. As Paulie said, we're going to have to get rid of the main problem, 90 or 100% removal, and we've started it with on the caribou thing. Yeah, we got to remove 90 or 100% of the dogs, the wolves. Yeah, and we got to get back to grizzly bear hunting again. No, full stop. No question, we got to get rid of some of the bears. Yeah, and the black bears too. We might as well we're going to have to double the number of black bears we kill too. And you know, those coyotes too, they're a problem. And the cougars. We can't just focus on one. We've got to do a job on all of them. But the main target are the wolves. We're going to have to do it. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck down here for a long time. Anyway, sorry for the bad news, but if I put it this way, if they can do it in Newfoundland, and if they can do it in Norway, there's no reason why we can't even do half of what they do. I'd settle for half, honestly.
Well, we have to settle for half because of the number of predators that we have.
Okay, but this is what we're faced with, and I almost feel guilty and at the same time sad, having to come here to present something like this. But this is not pleasant. But again, you have to realize that this was done with hunting and predation together. Yes. And the government, it was George Paulie who picked it up and said, look, boys, we have a problem. And he defined it, and believe it or not, these data, they sat on these data for 5 years. They didn't know what to do. But finally, after his presentation last year to the Game Commission, they said, yep, we're going to go for 90% removal. So there is hope.
Big step.
It is. So I applaud them for this. But Paulie, I don't know whether he's still working with the game people, but if we can do what Carmen has suggested, I would like to invite him up to tell us about more than just the numbers, a little bit of history too. I think it'd be really good. I would look at this as a prod. This is what tells us we have to do now. And in as much as my presentation is a bit gloomy, to say the least, I want to say, I think it's what we can take from this is the notion that we got to do something, and that's one of the most important steps that every one of us to decide on. And we can only do it by determining the cause and what that cause is going to cost us. And it's really essential that we stay focused, because I can tell you this, the perils of prediction, but I can tell you this, there are going to be some very unhappy people when they plug into our website and see this kind of information. They're not going to be happy. And so we should expect a little bit of a pushback. And from some quarters, it could be quite strong. So you know the old Boy Scout motto? Be prepared. Well, not only that, I'm going to give another. Be informed. If you don't know the subject, just tighten up a bit. But be informed. And whenever somebody throws something at you sideways and you know it's just not right or wrong, lay it on them. We have to defend ourselves. And this is part of the reason I'm making this presentation. So let's start our trip. It's going to be a long journey. Oh yeah.